I don't believe it. I do and I don't. I don't believe it until I can vouch for it. So I'm going to go to my profile. I'm used to this now. I'm going to go to my profile. I'm
Yeah,
going to
I
wait.
can see it.
I can't see it yet, though. Now I see it. I did it again. This is my 24th time doing it. So I did it again. It's great. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And I see proof that we're here, which is Dr. Sexy. Thank you so much. And Guy Mishmish, thank you. And everybody for joining us. So thank you very much. And Satoshi Yi, who I saw on another Periscope because we were discussing sales. So it was a pleasure seeing you then and seeing you now. And especially thank you to Rajeev and to Hart for joining me. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Thank you, Adam, for having us.
Yeah. And thank you so much for allowing me to have you guys. We've been planning this now for a couple of months, right?
Yeah, sometime. Yeah, been going back and forth.
Yeah. And we started planning this, I think, before you guys even. I don't know if you guys were working on the book when we started thinking about this, but I didn't know. Were you already working on the book?
Yes, we were.
All right, I didn't know that because we were discussing finance all the time. So
Yes.
a lot of my world and your guys' world is venture capital and finance, and that initially brought us to this meeting. And now you guys have a book, so that brought us again to this meeting. So thank you. Yeah, awesome. I know. I'm so proud of you guys. I'm so proud of you, and I read it. It's great. So. Rajeev and then Harsh, would you guys be kind enough to introduce yourselves? Would that be all right?
Yeah, sure. Harsh, I'll go first if that's okay. So, Adam, thank you so much again for having us on the show.
And thank you.
I'm an engineer by training. I did my undergraduate studies in the US at Northwestern. I studied materials engineering and I worked in venture capital down in New York at a fund called Lux Capital. And then after working at Lux, I returned to India and set up a early stage investing practice, focusing on science-driven innovation. So, been doing that for about 9 or 10 years now. And in addition to that, I also invest in the public markets in India. In the middle, I also came back to New York, got my MBA from Columbia University, formally studied value investing there. So it's been a fun ride for the last 8-10 years investing in public and private markets in India.
Thank you, Adam, for having me as well. I have I think a very similar background to Rajeev, which kind of makes sense why we've written this book together. So I'm actually an engineering dropout from the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, IIT Delhi. And then I decided to study economics at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, USA. I came back to India. I worked for MIT's Poverty Action Lab.
Wow.
The professors, the economists who just, I think, last year won the Nobel Prize or whatever.
Wow.
Economics, randomized controlled trials. After that, I moved to finance. I did a lot of financial consulting in India and Singapore. Then I did my MBA at INSEAD, which is an MBA school at Singapore and France. I worked for Bain and Company in London and Houston for some time.
Wow, that's right. I remember we had discussed that.
Yes, and then I have been investing in the public markets formally for a group called Ashika for the last 3 years in Mumbai. And alongside of that, I have been writing with Rajeev and separately columns for about the last 10 years or so. And so those columns actually ended up becoming this book, A New Idea of India, that Rajeev and I have co-authored. I actually co-authored a book with a couple of other friends called Derivatives, about financial derivatives, and it's published by Cambridge University Press.
Wow.
That's more of a textbookish kind of thing. This is the first kind of popular nonfiction that both Rajeev and I have written, and it's about the political economy of India. The subtitle is Individual Rights in a Civilizational State, but we'll get to it. So that's my and Rajiv's background.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't realize that there was so much academia with you guys. That's pretty remarkable.
Well, yeah.
I grew up in the US actually.
Did you really? Where'd you grow up?
No, so the academia, a lot of it was in the US for both of us.
Yeah. So how did you guys decide to kind of study here, become overseas students here and have professions here, and then return back to India?
Well, obviously the US has the world's best universities. So I think it's at the top of the list for anyone who's looking to study internationally. I was drawn to it simply for that reason.
Yeah. And
I was also drawn to it for the flexibility of the US educational system.
Yeah.
So, which is now, I think, the other national educational systems are now trying to copy. But the idea of choosing a major, changing it, having a major or minor, double major, I thought that was quite fascinating. And the reason both came back is what we'll discuss. We are both very fortunate to be able to come back, and also we are very bullish on India. We're long India. So.
Yeah, and it's something we're going to be discussing because this is part of the investor series. And Harsh, you might want to come a little bit closer to the camera, just so you know. I know you seem pretty comfortable there, but sometimes the microphone can't follow you where you are, right? So it's something we're going to be discussing.
Nice.
What is that?
I said Harsh is on a very nice chair.
He is definitely. I need to get a chair like that. In none of my places, nowhere do I have a chair like that. My chairs are always a little bit uncomfortable. So your chair looks comfortable. This is part of what I call the investor series, right? And you guys are actually number 8. So the first one was with Valina, and we were discussing kind of the bifurcation of the world. And this conversation is going to be part of that as well. All of them are part of it, and this conversation is going to be a big part of it because we're seeing a bifurcation of the world. We're seeing the world kind of cleaved into different places. Harsh, you might want to mute yourself just because I think there might be a little bit of feedback. Yeah, the feedback's gone. So the world is being bifurcated. And we're seeing the opportunity for India to be a real beneficiary of that. So we're seeing, I don't want to say Europe on a decline, but certainly we're seeing changes, structural changes, political changes, economic changes. And some part of that is being filled by China, right? That's clear. And then you have a whole bunch of countries now that are kind of jockeying for third place, right? And also as China itself is now being disrupted, because of its trade routes, and I know we're going to discuss this, and supply chains and its own technology, we're seeing a really aggressive competition for who's going to be the nucleus of downstream innovation. Space Force is important to both the United States and to China, but one of the difficulties of Space Force is it's so astronomically expensive, and some parts of that is very low yield. So high yield is getting those satellites into space. Low yield are the parts, the manufacturing, the chip designs, the chip fabrications, and those also require a very dense supply chain. So we're going to be discussing that. So this is Investor Series Part 8. I think the second one we were talking about the fossil fuels because India needs energy, and the third one we were discussing nuclear because given the choices, you guys need nuclear and you guys need the infrastructure to be able to support nuclear. And then moving on, we had discussed other things. And now last week, we actually did a kirtan and we did some Hanuman Chalisa. And hopefully everybody enjoyed that relaxation and that kind of investment in ourselves. And now we're going to start really delving into India. And I think one of the things that your book actually helps me with is having been there many times and traveled, a lot of people might think of India as America over there, right? And sometimes, people think of China as America, but over there with it. Slightly different, but essentially similar people operating systems that are driven by culture and driven by, the dynamics. And I don't think that's accurate. I don't think India is America over there. I don't think China is America over there. So would it be, maybe it's a good thing to do is to start with your guys' book and just kind of giving the thought behind the book and what you hope to accomplish with the book and kind of what the story is of the book. Would that be all right to just kind of begin there and then we'll go into trade and some other stuff? You're both on mute.
Should I go, Rajeev? Okay, yeah, okay.
Yeah, go for it, man. Go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, Adam. So the book is, as I was mentioning, the genesis of the book is Rajeev and I co-authoring a bunch of columns over the last decade, and then a couple of years ago we decided to make an anthology book out of it, but then we realized that a lot of the material is outdated, so we basically ended up writing a new book. So that's on the genesis side of it. Now on the substance of the book. See, I think India is actually still not very well understood outside of India, which is surprising because its population is 1.35 billion, which is all the Americas and Europe put together. Again, it's North America, South America, and Europe put together. Well, if it's not that, it's almost that. It's a very, very, very large and complex place. Our subtitle is Individual Rights in a Civilizational State. We call it a civilization. What is a civilization in this sense? Civilization is the largest unit of humanity, largest coherent unit of humanity short of all of humanity itself. And the reason that's different for India is the civilization state and the nation state mostly coincide. That's not the case for the West. In the West, you have the United States, you have Canada, you have UK, you have France, you have the rest of European Union. You even have Australia and New Zealand, which are nowhere in the West, but they are the West, right? So they are basically predominantly white Christian cultures.
Yes.
That's what we call the West today. Or the post-Christian Christendom is the West. And except Turkey, maybe, which is a bit of an exception in NATO alliance, all the security architecture is also very much within that civilizational realm, if you could just add Japan and South Korea to it. So civilizations are real. You don't have to believe in Samuel Huntington's clash of civilizations necessarily to realize that they're real. Now, why is that important for India? In India, it's important because a lot of the debate around nationalism uses the operating model of Westphalian states, right? And a lot of the Western literature, because of the trauma of the two world wars, the German and French cousins fighting each other and so on and so forth, they kind of transport that trauma into India, thinking that nationalism will be a destructive force. But India is more like the European Union, in fact, bigger than that, because even the United States of the West is within the Indian equivalent of the civilization. So India is one of the key poles of the world going forward. What is the big picture of the last 200 years? Economic divergence. The West racing ahead on a per capita income compared to other parts of the world. Now, India is at $2,000 per capita income. The West cumulatively might be $40,000 to $50,000. The US is $65,000 or something like that. So you can do the math. You can adjust for cost of living, whatever. So the weight of India will only increase with every few passing years. And I think we're only scratching the surface. So the book says India has so far been dealt with an ideology which Rajeev and I call the Nehruvian ideology, which is based on, but not necessarily one-to-one, the same as Jawaharlal Nehru's ideology, who was the first Prime Minister of India, who had a non-aligned view in foreign policy, but effectively we ended up being in the Soviet orbit after the late 60s, who's rejected kind of capitalism and went for socialism, but we ended up with being with crony capitalism.
Yeah.
And who had a view of secularism, which did not see individual citizens as individuals, but as members of religious groups, which has led to a lot of tension. And on all these three counts, to varying extents, we push back, and therefore we don't just criticize an idea, we give alternatives in detail for governance, for social policy, for politics, for education, for healthcare, for defense. So I think that would be a good summary from my side before I hand over to Rajeev.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that you also asked Adam like what we hope to accomplish with the book and so on.
Yeah.
I would say this is an attempt by us to present a new thesis on what is happening in India, on where India is going, and really we want people to be able to understand better what is happening as this great ancient civilization transforms into a nation state, and we believe very soon a great power on the world stage too.
I expect it to be a great power on the world stage also, and I see that it's in the midst of a transformation. You guys have the perfect demographics. You guys are, a sovereign democracy. You have really good demographics to allow the country to kind of boom. You've got a great reservoir of intellectual capital. And I'm very interested in how India starts bringing back some of those overseas students who graduated here, wrote a lot of academic papers in the United States as part of their studies. And now, do those students, do you think, start coming back to India? Because there is a little bit still of a chasm from my experience, and we'll discuss my experience a little bit. There is still a little bit of a chasm that India has to jump in order to be able to woo those students back. Those students in America are used to capitalism. They're used to kind of the rewards for their effort, and they're used to a different way of valuing their own contribution. Rather than, in the United States, they value it in terms of stock options and in terms of their pay. While as in India, it's still a little bit, you're contributing to a system that doesn't necessarily contribute back to you as much.
So I would say on that, Adam, that it is you're right. It's very much driven by a different economic system, a different sort of set of financial incentives, the kind of things that you can do in the US today as a young person. Frankly, they're pretty phenomenal if you're a young entrepreneur or a founder, and especially one with technical talent. But that, I would say, that is also happening in India now. Obviously, not to the same degree, but I've been around here for 10 years now, investing in startups, and the transformation is real. And actually, the second point also, which I would make on this aspect of talent returning back, or people choosing to come back to India, I've always felt that one of the big reasons people tend to want to stay abroad is that staying abroad is a social escape as much as it is an economic escape.
Very
so yeah, so the kind of social life, freedom, and so on that one enjoys in the US, especially if you're not from one of India's big cities, that kind of a thing you may or may not get in India if you were to, let's say, go back to whichever hometown you're from. So I've always felt that that's a big factor actually too, and in that sense, having a sort of social liberation is equally important for India. And frankly, as we have described in the book too, we are seeing that. We are seeing sort of it filtering down from, let's say, Mumbai, Bangalore, Delhi, into other tier 2 towns, into other tier 3 towns. There is an aspect of popular culture also over here, which is changing popular attitudes, changing people's sort of mindsets in some way. Obviously, we are very far away from what the West is or what the United States is, but the change is real. So net, I would say, if you are someone in the US today, getting a PhD or a master's degree or whatever, and it's very different. The decision on whether to come back to India or not is very different than it was, let's say, 30 or 40 years ago, when frankly it wasn't even a question. There was no choice but to stay in the US, almost for everyone.
Yeah, that's
I fully agree with as I said. Basically, it's a social transformation and an economic transformation. But I do think, see, India is at the cusp of many virtuous cycles. India is at the cusp of a snowball, and the larger the market becomes, the more talented people want to come back. The larger the market further becomes, then it has further snowballs in terms of its financial markets, further snowball in terms of its tax policy. It's a snowball that is starting. And therefore, see, the point is, there are many reasons. You can talk about urban quality of life, taxes, this and that, social aspects. But at the end of the day, I think within a couple of years, within 3-4 years, you could do anything you want in Bangalore that you could do in San Francisco.
really.
Yeah, maybe you're not there right now, but I think you'll be there in 3-4 years. Already, Flipkart was sold to Walmart for 17-18 billion dollars. And if you're making out of India, you're making for the world. the competitor for Uber, Ola, is not just in India, it's outside India as well. Zomato is not just in India, it's outside of India as well. So, Indian entrepreneurs are saying all these American multinationals have their back offices in Pune, Bangalore, Hyderabad with all these talent. All you need is some risk capital and some risk takers to get them to work for you as opposed to an American multinational or over and above an American multinational. And while it is important to get the very best talent, a lot of which is still in the United States, I think the sheer number and the pipeline in India it doesn't make it necessary for all of them to come back, number one. And number two, it's useful to have a very good diaspora there, which further deepens technological and financial links. So, I don't worry too much about the brain drain. And if I did too much, anyways, American policies are making me worry less about it. So America is not welcoming much as it was. It's very difficult to get a visa, very difficult to get a green card. So that's good for India. More and more people will come back.
Yeah, it's interesting because I had this conversation yesterday with actually one of your former heads of Intel, which I thought was a really interesting conversation. And we were discussing Make in India. So I'm going to let you guys do a lot of the explaining. So do you guys want to give a sense of what Make in India is, and particularly within the defense industry, which I'm a part of? So I'm Make in India in America. Rajeev, I'll leave that to you. You're still on mute, Rajeev.
Rajeev, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. No, so I was saying, obviously there's been a lot of debate in recent months on, India's so-called the import substitution policy and whether we are turning towards protectionism again. But as Harsh and I have made the case in one of the chapters in the book, that we see this as very qualitatively different from what the experience was in the 70s and 80s, where there was rampant licensing, price controls for every kind of even minor business decision. An entrepreneur in India would need to run to New Delhi if they were trying to manufacture something. So the thrust on Make in India now, I think the government has made a push to reduce imports, which means making a lot of electronics in India now, a lot of home kind of consumable items, consumer goods in India now, and defense is a very big part of that. Actually, India is today one of the world's largest importers of defense equipment. So now if we believe that India is going to be one of the world's great powers, I don't see a path where you become one of those powers without having a large defense and technology industrial base in the country. The question is, why did India become such a large importer of weapons and armaments in particular, talking about the defense industry? Well, there was a policy of not allowing the private sector any kind of sort of sway of any meaningful kind. So what has changed recently is that the private sector has got a foot in the door, and that is actually enabled by, in my view, one of the biggest things is a clean government in New Delhi. So in the past there have been all kinds of corruption scandals related to defense acquisitions, and one of the biggest changes enabling the entry of the private sector in defense is today there is a clean government in Delhi where even Narendra Modi's worst critics, have not been able to sort of pin him on corruption, or that stain has not stayed on him in any way, even though they have tried to fling all kinds of mud. So now we are in a situation where you are seeing large foreign defense manufacturers coming to the country, FDI caps being relaxed. Domestically, entrepreneurs are looking at the space because there is a sea change in defense procurement. So all these things put together create space for the private sector, and frankly, enable India to develop a defense and technology industrial base, which is actually key to developing itself as an economy and sort of becoming a more powerful country.
Well, do you guys?
So
I'm sorry, Harsh. May I just ask one question because it's so interesting to me? And do you guys also feel that the defense industry, it's the booming of the defense industry, and I know we're going to discuss that because there really is a boom going on within India right now in the startup ecosystem and within the public markets as well, where I know you guys have a lot of background. Do you feel that there's within the population there's a convening force that there's a real threat from China, from Pakistan, and from those political regimes? So do you feel the belligerence? You guys just had the Doklam standoff, so feel free to speak of that. You guys are having a standoff right now. So is there a feeling that the defense and developing your defense industry to make it a real world power is also a way of kind of fending off any real lengthy, prolonged conflicts with China? I mean, what do you feel is the underlying thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely, Adam. I think I think nations mentally benchmark themselves against other nations. If you just go very psychologically about it, a bit of pop psychology there, I think India has benchmarked itself against China, and I think the Chinese have benchmarked themselves against the United States.
Yeah.
I think it's a bit sad that India has not benchmarked itself against the United States directly, but nevertheless, we'll take it as it is. And what has happened is the Chinese economy, which is now 5 times larger than India's, is feeling that it has a moment, a corridor, a small window of trying to change the status quo with respect to India on the border, in general, make it subservient in Asia. And to that end, while we had an earlier standoff in Doklam, which is the India, Bhutan, Tibet triangle in more northeast India, this is more northern India and Ladakh. What is happening right now, there is something called line of actual control, LOAC, which is not demarcated. There is no mutually agreed demarcation. And it's basically a dry, cold plateau. It's an extension of eastern Tibet, western Tibet. And there, we fought a war there in 1962 along with the Eastern Frontier, and we are doing the same things again. And China wants to change the facts on the ground. Now, what India has realized is, for example, some weapons, when it instantly went to Russia for asking, they'll come, but there is an element of the efficacy of those weapons, the technology of those weapons, but also Russia is gradually going into the Chinese orbit. And therefore, India, which was historically one of the biggest purchasers of Russian arms, needs to get out of that. And what India did, and secondly, even when it wants to buy from the West, at least till recently, America would put on a lot of conditions, till like 10, 15 years ago. Because we were not exactly that friendly as we became in the last 10, 15 years, especially after the 1998 nuclear tests in Pokhran 2. America and Japan actually sanctioned India for 1 or 2 years before we kind of turned it around. America realizing that, well, actually, it's kind of good that these guys have a nuclear weapon because then we can take on China. And ultimately, in that sense, power speaks. So I think India, as Rajeev hinted, from 2004 to 2014, we did not move much ahead on either defense import acquisition. There was some corruption and there was fear of corruption. And we did not create our own industrial defense complex. What Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex in a negative way. I think that's India badly needs that. Our defense armaments are produced by public sector units, many of which are not even incorporated, they're directly owned by the Ministry of Defense. And because we are not a totalitarian state, we are a democratic state, we have unions. We have real unions. We don't have fake Chinese communist unions. Yeah. Our unions say they won't work, and actually a union threatened to not work while the standoff is going on with China in Ladakh, because we are only incorporating them to public sector units, right, instead of direct ownership from Ministry of Defense. So basically, people are sick and tired of this whole drama now. We don't want to wear the badge of the world's biggest importer with any kind of pride. It basically shows us, for technological laggards that we are. And what we've done besides the private sector, as Rajeev hinted, is we are also allowing the foreign sector to come in. The thinking goes that if you're going to import weapons,
I'm raising my hand right here. That's
yeah.
I'm a part of that, and I'm just going to interrupt for 1 second because it's so interesting. It is interesting watching the transformation going on within the defense industry. And it's interesting also watching it. And I was having this conversation yesterday that you can watch out as there's so many wrinkles in it, right? And it feels like you're kind of ironing a shirt almost, because you have a shirt that is maybe like 50 years old, and it's got a lot of Russian influences in it, where there was a lot of corruption, where the Russians were responsible for the procurement. So it was Russians within the Indian military who were saying, let's buy more Russian goods, let's buy more MiG jets, and let's buy more Russian goods. And now you can see that it's kind of being smoothed out, but it takes time. It takes time to kind of exfiltrate out all those Russians. And at the same time, it takes time for India to figure out how to build up its own military and how to build up its own defense and how to build up its defense industries. And I think Modi has been very specific, and your Ministry of Defense, Singh, has been very specific with saying that we're not necessarily going to be your biggest customer. So he's telling his own Hindustan Aero and some of the local Indian companies, you guys need to go out and find customers. So you can't rely on us to be your biggest buyer. Those days are over. So it's interesting watching that transformation as well.
I'll just finish the point that I was making there.
Yeah.
I agree with your observations, Adam. And I think what's happening is India. I mean, we should not totally underestimate or dismiss. India has an LCA Tejas. India does have a plane. India does have a lot of armaments. Of course, India's entire space and nuclear programs are indigenous, in the sense that because we could not import stuff there, we actually made when we had to. So it's interesting, whenever we were not allowed imports, we actually were able to create with our own scientific base in whatever way possible. Where we were allowed imports, that's where the chances of cronyism came in. And the part of the book is basically the transformation from this kind of feudal third world patronage-based state to a competent new nation state grounded in a civilizational pride that therefore says, we refuse to be dinner on the geopolitical table. We want to be one of the diners, right? And I think that sense of self-confidence is what Narendra Modi, more than anything else, symbolically has been able to bring. And just on the point of foreign technology, so the idea is, if we are going to get foreign stuff, let's at least get them to be manufactured in India. At least you'll have some technology spin-offs. At least you'll have some kind of ancillary ecosystem developing in whatever couple of different corridors you'll have. So it's a very pragmatic move, because people who were opposed to FDI and defense in India were very happy importing weapons. And they could not understand the kind of contradiction there, because if you're ready to buy billions of dollars of weapons, might as well spend that locally and at least have some spin-offs domestically. But more broadly, it's not just defense. Make in India is very similar to what George Washington and Alexander Hamilton thought of in the late 18th and early 19th century, and people around them. You must remember that the main competitor for the US then, in those 2-3 decades, was the UK. And their friend was France. And right now, India is the US, the UK is China, and France is the United States. And what Alexander Hamilton and George Washington said, let's have tariffs, because the forces of habit, of inertia of industry are such that if we do not have some tariffs, if we do not have some subsidies, we will end up only importing manufactured goods from the UK. And actually,
this was a renowned report on manufacturers.
In 1790.
I'm going to interrupt everything because there's so many questions, and you guys are just awesome. You guys, we could spend a couple of days here because it's so interesting, and you guys are so elegant in explaining it all. There's a lot of questions, and one of them I thought was really interesting, and it's also kind of from my observation. So I'm going to let you guys respond to this. Rayo Deepak, and thank you so much for being here. Says, I hope we don't blindly copy all of the aspects of San Francisco, etc. Certain fads making their way aren't healthy. That's a very legitimate point, because at a certain point, having had a place in San Francisco and really observed it, is consumerism and kind of a loss of kind of cultural ties can create a lot of unwelcome social disruption.
Rajeev, do you want to take, or should I go ahead?
I'm gonna let him speak that because I like his microphone a little bit better.
You want me to go first?
Yeah, please.
Okay. No, so it's true. I don't think anyone is suggesting that there should be blind copying. I don't think that's even possible actually, because obviously India has its own distinctive culture, and in fact, even Indians when they move around inside India, discover aspects of the sort of different regions which are very treasured in the country actually. So I don't think that kind of homogenization, of or Californication, if you want, would happen. I'm pretty confident of that because India has a strong cultural identity and it will retain that.
But it's how much of a corrosive factor is consumerism and the smartphone? Because when
I don't agree with that, Adam. Actually, because I grew up in a country which saw very low growth rates, which didn't have all these choices. So in fact, I find that kind of objection when I read commentary in the United States or in Europe that we have too much consumerism. Well, they haven't seen shortages. They haven't seen like lack of choice. So I look at it with amusement, to be very honest with you.
And we're gonna start ripping through questions because there's so many here and there's so much. They're better than anything I would have thought of. So I really appreciate. And Vishnu Bhatta, thank you so much for being here. Says, how can we make it conducive for Indian startups to go public in India versus larger PE rounds?
Oh, this is a terrific question, actually. In fact, the Indian government is, as we speak, working on rules to allow Indian registered companies to list on any exchange or on a number of notified, accepted global exchanges in the US, UK, Singapore, and a few other countries.
But not Hong Kong.
But not Hong Kong. Yes. So very soon you could have an Indian company list abroad. Right now there is a barrier on that because there is a rule that says Indian companies have to list in India before they can list abroad. Also, obviously, there's a need for Indian companies to go public in India on Indian exchanges. But for that, certain types of IPO sort of liberalizations, IPO rule liberalizations, capital market reforms are necessary. I think those are under discussion. Hopefully, there should be some breakthrough in India. I fully agree, obviously, that we want many of the high growth kind of Indian ventures listing in India so that retail investors and other kinds of investors can purchase those shares and trade freely.
And I see No Worries is there. And thank you so much, No Worries 2020, who I suspect is really a fantastic salesperson because we've had some phenomenal conversations in different periscopes about it. So thank you so much for being here as well. And this is their observation, which is India is America's important ally, but countries are at different stages of development.
Okay, so first of all, India and America are not treaty allies the way India and Japan are, or America and Japan are, and America and Australia are. So we are friends and almost allies, but we are not allies. And of course, the stages of development are extremely different, which is why the US has a GDP of 21 trillion and India has a GDP of 3 trillion, 7 times less, even though India's population is 4 times more. So that's just the math, right? You have a per capita income difference of almost 30 times. Even adjusted for cost of living, that's around 8 times or something like that, 8 or 9 times. But I think the question is to understand in what context. You see, the convergence right now is happening very rapidly, and this could look very different just one generation from now, which is nothing for a civilization like India. It's nothing even for the Republic of the US, which is now 220 or 30 odd years old, right? So I mean, or 240. So it's really nothing in the larger scheme of things. It's within a lifetime, yes. So I think the relationship between the two will be very interesting because the US is used to being the boss of formal allies. And India has proven to be very frustrating to the US even earlier. Not always agreeing with the US on Iran or Russia and other, like where the US expects deference. And I think that in different kind of issues that will remain. I mean, even the 4 foundational agreements that India has signed with the US, on Comcasa, the communication ones, the basic exchange one, the logistics one. And there's another one. The interesting thing is the names, the acronyms of them were just slightly modified and slightly renegotiated compared to the NATO and the Japanese and South Korean ones. And I'm suspecting the changes were as much real as they were symbolic. I think it will be one of the most interesting relationships of the 21st century, broadly very friendly. But I do think that people just linearly extrapolate, and there's a lot of talk about just China and America and G2. Neil Ferguson 10, 12 years ago coined that very awkward word called Chamerica. And now he says, that was more of a chimera. But I do think that it will be much more of a triangle, and depending on whether European Union can be one coherent entity, a quadrangle around 20, 30 years from now.
Yeah, really interesting. So, Wordy Snurdy, thank you so much for being here. And I thought this was interesting also, so thank you for pointing it out. You called it the largest unit of humanity, and they say that's an interesting way to put it.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting way to frame it. And I'm going to skip through here. Avatans, thank you so much for being here. It says namaste, Adam, Rajav, and Harsh.
Namaste.
Thank you, Hare Krishna. Thank you. And we're going to skip through. So in the corporate world, the culture is comparable. You guys' thoughts on that?
No, I would say in the highest echelons of corporate India, that is true. But obviously, Indian business is not the Infosys and HDFCs and TCSs of the world, right? There are many Indian businesses, and they have different cultures, different ways of working, probably from American business operating obviously in a context.
But it is not more similar than different. I mean, the Indian elite speaks English. We are extremely influenced by American pop culture, soft power. And there is a lot of exchanges at the educational and professional level by now. So I would say it's probably
now with the Netflix, 150 rupee mobile plan, you have almost everyone in India able to afford a Netflix subscription.
What is? I didn't realize that. What's the cost of it out there?
So Netflix in India, Adam, Netflix offers a 150 rupees a month plan, which is available for viewing on a mobile device and a single screen. So for about $2 a month, you can watch Netflix shows.
Interesting. I don't watch a lot of TV, so that still wouldn't work for me. But yeah, I'm a YouTube guy. So DM Swab, thank you so much for being here.
But all those influences, the cultural influences now, for a while they were restricted. Those American sort of cultural influences were restricted to the cream of the society. But I think now with the rise of digital platforms, there is a much wider access, and I'm sure a lot of people who would have otherwise never been able to, let's say, watch a Netflix or a Disney show are able to see that now.
Yeah. Interesting. So
the cultural influence is also vice versa. I mean, the cultural influence is less so, but I do think India has had a cultural influence in the United States.
For sure.
And not just in the modern age, but even the 19th century transcendentalists and all these kind of heterodox religious movements, kind of the Hinduism without the Hindu word in America were very much, there were a lot of Orientalists reading the Bhagavad Gita, reading the Vedas and Upanishads. I think there has been an influence the other way. Mahatma Gandhi's movement influenced MLK Jr., the non-violence, the non-cooperative movement. Robert Oppenheimer famously quoted from the Gita after the first nuclear bomb blast in the US. And now I have become the world. He quoted Vishnu or Krishna from Gita after the first, horrific but kind of impressive nuclear test. So I think the influence has been more subtle the other way around, but it has been much more pronounced America to India.
Thank you. That was very helpful. So DM Swab, thank you so much for being here. Asks, what are the major political parties, coalitions, movements in India, any rising political stars? And could you also give a very brief, I'd appreciate that answer. Could you also give a very brief kind of explanation of the political structural system? Can you do that? Do you think pretty
Okay. Yeah, sure. So India is a federal democracy. We have what 28, 29 states, Rajiv, and we have around 8 or 9 union territories. Sorry, we just removed one state and made it 2 union territories, so I lost count. But we have 30 states or a bit less, and we have the prime minister, who's the top executive person. The president in India is more like the British monarch. They are the first citizen of the Indian Republic, but their powers are somewhat ceremonial. And we don't have a bipolar, bipartisan. The bipolar is very correct for the US. Bipartisan system in India. We have multiple parties, and part of the reason is we don't have internal democracy in India. The right wing, so-called right wing party, is the party which is in power. It's called the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party.
Translated roughly as Indian People's Party.
Yeah, translated as Indian People's Party. And the center-left party, which was historically in power for 6 out of 7 decades, has been Indian National Congress. And they're the center-left party. They are right now, they have less than 10% of the lower House of Parliament seats. BJP is also quite powerful in many of the states. They have many states. The US equivalent of your governor would be chief minister here. And BJP has many chief ministers. All the BJP is not as dominant in state elections as it is in national elections, because the Prime Minister Narendra Modi is one of the most popular world leaders with great ratings within his own country, that is India. Now so this movement is called Hindutva, or it's called Hindu nationalism. The BJP's kind of main movement. There's a lot of focus on obviously economic development and corruption-free governance. And I think that will continue to remain in ascendance for some time. There are no rising political stars. The only person who kind of challenged Narendra Modi was a chief minister of Delhi, or more of a mayor of Delhi, around 6 years ago, but he kind of brutally lost. And now he's just kind of restricted to that small area of Delhi. And the leader of the center-left Indian National Congress is a 4th or 5th generation dynast called Rahul Gandhi. Nothing to do with Mahatma Gandhi. It's a different family, and he is kind of a bumbling dynast and the butt of all jokes in India. So right now it seems that the BJP and Modi are quite dominant, despite the economy not doing that well because of various reforms and coronavirus. They seem quite dominant.
And I would just add there, actually, so anyone who's interested in learning about India, if you are in the US or anywhere else in the Western world, I would say, the best way to learn about India is to read. So India publishes some good English language newspapers, such as the Hindustan Times and the Indian Express. Nowadays, you can read those online. If you go by the reportage of the Western media on India, you'll get a very skewed picture. So my recommendation would be, if you want to understand India, then best to read the English language media in India. I mean, even that has a lot of problems, but it's better than the Western media.
Yeah, it's interesting because I do read a lot of the publications, and it's interesting because in India they're a lot better delineated, and there's a lot more intellectual effort that goes in some of the journalism there. Even some of that is very, very left, some of it that's right in the middle, and some of it's very on the right, on the different iterations of them. But there's a lot of good academics on all of their sides. So one of the things that I have picked up is there's a lot of good writing. There's a lot of really good intellectual effort that's going into them on all the different sides. So with us, sometimes I feel as though it's a little bit more simplified, and all the nuances are lost, and everything's kind of turned into just kind of a 1 second image of something, and then you just file it away. I think in India, there is a lot more complexity to some of the issues, and I think that expresses itself in some better academics and a lot better journalism and writing. Here's an interesting question. It's, again, a conversation I had yesterday. Such an important question and comment is, thank you so much for being here, Prak. I can't see the name correctly because the light's right in my eyes. Okay, thank you so much. And they say the lack of good higher education and extremely high land values are big problems.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. Historically, although I must say, land values and real estate values have kind of rationalized in the last 7-8 years, especially inflation adjusted or as a percentage of GDP or GDP per capita. And also on the education side, there are some good reforms finally happening. But I think the big hope that both Rajiv and I often discuss about is technology and ed tech, both for primary, secondary, as well as higher education. Now, on the land price, I think this is very interesting because India historically underinvested in roads and physical hard infra.
Harsh, could you come closer to the microphone? Would that be all right?
Yeah, India historically underinvested in physical hard infrastructure, but I think it's changing. It has changed, and what has happened is now that all these kind of, not suburbs is not the right word in an American sense, but satellite towns around the key big cities in India are developing. For example, Noida for Delhi, or development of Havra or this Rajarhat area in Calcutta, or Navi Mumbai for Mumbai, where it's easier the commute from the city center, and therefore you can buy a house at relatively cheaper rates. And I think that will just accelerate with more infrastructure, with more public transport, along with the fact that we kind of did not talk about coronavirus, the kind of elephant in the room, and the acceleration of this Zoom trend of working from home is the biggest beneficiary of that in the world is India. Because in India now you can be in a tier 2 town close to a big city, but you can effectively work 5 or 4 days out of a week from there, and maybe just go to your main office once a week, and therefore you can save amazing amounts of money on rent. And I think that will allow for purchasing power to increase substantially. There are a lot of these American multinational, what are known as GICs, global in-house centers or global capability centers, basically like in-house KPOs or BPOs, kind of back offices for all these big American companies who are opening. Almost every single American company has a shop in some.
In fact, the shocking statistic is the annual spend of the GCC sort of industry, like the amount that they do in terms of dollar R&D, is higher than the R&D spend of the entire country.
Wow.
And there are about 1 million people actually working in the GCC sort of sector.
Guys, we're going to go into a bit of a speed round now because I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and you guys are just so awesome. And it's been 53 minutes, and we're going to try and wrap up around 1 hour and 5. All right. So it's going to be kind of like the Family Feud, and you guys have to press that button, or like Jeopardy. It's going to be like Jeopardy, where you guys have to do that. Okay. So can you also be responsive to the lack of the good higher education? Because schools is a big problem in India. I mean, one of the places where I have seen, as I've tried to hire, people and kind of get a better understanding, is the school system all the way kind of downstream has problems. You don't always have like the best teachers. Horrible for me to say, but it's been my observation that that some of these issues are real big legacy issues that go all the way downstream with schools.
No, you're right. I think there are lots of problems there, and it comes down to incentives actually, because many of the schools, the kind of schools that you're talking about, they're essentially government schools where the teachers have guaranteed employment, guaranteed pay. So how do you make them accountable for their work is a big challenge for all both the state and this kind of central government, union government. But as Harsh was mentioning, the whole digitization wave that we're seeing in India now, so that is sort of helping sort of get around this problem, because digital tools are democratizing access to education, to learning, and so on. And in fact, that's one of the hottest spaces right now in the venture world. What's called EdTech.
If I'm not wrong,
hold on, Harsh. It sounds like you're an announcer in a stadium, because the way the mic picked you up. I'm going to skip around a little bit though. Is that all right? Because Rajeev buzzed in quicker than you did, so he won that one. So Thal, thank you so much for being here. Says thrilled to join this one live for once. Great information. Thank you for your time. And thank you for being here. And I want to see, if I recall, you're somewhere around Colorado and you've got some nice dogs. I'd love to see those pictures again. So Apu RV, thank you so much for being here. Asks, why has there been reluctance to make bigger SEZs, which are special economic zones, like China?
The thing in India is India cannot copy. I think Rajiv, can you go mute? I think my voice is echoing from your side. Okay, isn't echoing now? It's not echoing now. Okay, so I think the problem is India cannot have massive special export zones given its democracy, because you can't have labor laws applicable in the hinterland and not applicable in large parts. It doesn't work like that. And I mean, I know it sounds attractive as a concept, but having massive tax breaks and massive labor law deregulation in large parts of India would just not work the way it worked for the Chinese East Coast.
Wow, that's really interesting. And it makes me think of some of the difficulties we're seeing Pakistan encountering now as they've got a to-do list of about 12 special economic zones, and they've got uncompleted about 11 of them, because these things are also expensive. It requires Western dollars. Either it's going to require American Western dollars, or it's going to require Chinese dollars. And these things are very unpredictable. You don't know what the revenue is going to be back from these things. So there's a lot of speculation, and COVID has certainly, had some damage on GDP. So the predictability of revenue and be able to service debt has also become an interesting thing. So want to be responsive to this question as well, because No Worries asks, and ask somebody else, so thank you for engaging in that conversation between you, says, how are land values a big problem? I'll let one of you guys buzz in.
Well, I mean, historically, India's density of population is around 400 people per square kilometers. And in the Gangetic Plains, it's about 1,000 people per square kilometers, which is basically Greater New York. So the population density of Greater New York is the population densities all of the Gangetic Plains. So there is less land. Then we also have a lot of land use restrictions, which are bureaucratic, and from colonial times, it's difficult to convert agricultural land into residential land or factory land. And we're slowly reforming and deregulating that as well. And also because a lot of corruption, what we colloquially call black money in India, went into real estate or land values, because that is one way you can later on convert it into, quote unquote white money or account it for money. But again, so it is a problem because it led to higher factory costs, higher rents, and all those issues. But I think it's an issue that is now perhaps more in the rear mirror.
And Bimani, thank you so much for being here. Says, which industries are most suited for moving manufacturing to India after China?
Well, I personally...
Yeah, go for Harsh. Go first.
Well, I personally think the most obvious moves are in the low value add, like textiles, footwear, and this is where historically India has lost
labor-intensive light manufacturers. Yeah,
labor-intensive light manufacturing, where India has historically lost out to China, and now of late even Vietnam and Bangladesh. But only in the last couple of years you've seen labor reforms, you've seen a corporate tax cut, and we're seeing all kind of production-linked incentives. Electronics, I think, is huge. I think a lot of smartphone manufacturing is already coming to India. But I do think that, the playbook for 2020s will be a bit different. India historically has always done better, surprisingly, in more capital-intensive manufacturing, partially because of our labor laws and partially because, we have good talent on the upper side. So I think in industries which will do even better are chemicals, because there's a lot of environmental push from China. And there's a lot of pull of tariffs, because everybody's decoupling, as you mentioned in the beginning, Adam. And I think all kinds of manufacturing that we can think of, plastics, which is also related to chemicals. I think pharma, a lot of APIs we realized this year we had to import from China. And we don't want to import that from China to that extent. And the same for the US also. The US also does not want to be dependent on China for that much.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting when you speak of pharmaceuticals and a lot of the innovation, because I think one of the difficulties we've had with China has been intellectual property theft. Obviously, I've discussed this a lot, and I think you described it as India is not an ally in the sense of our relationship with Japan and countries within Europe. And it's going to be interesting to see now as a lot of data agreements are signed, and there's a lot of intellectual transfers and knowledge transfers that are going to be happening in defense. How much the pharmaceutical industry in India kind of modifies to become a little bit more sharing, and not just a cloning, kind of the generic. So it's really an evolution for what's occurring in India within the pharmaceutical industry, because that has been a problem.
Yeah, well, India has historically exported only generics. You're right.
Yeah.
And actually, I think, especially the last 6-7 years, Adam, things went really sideways because there was a huge problem with the clinical trial regulatory regime in the country, in India. And that has only come back on rails about a year ago. I think, if I remember correctly, July 2019 is when those the modified rules were notified, and that's in place.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I apologize for that brief interruption. It is that like Jeopardy type of thing. And I buzzed in on that one too. You just couldn't see it, but it was there. So this is a question actually for you guys, but I'm going to be responsive to it first, because it's kind of an interesting phenomenon that I see in the United States, and I discuss it a lot on Twitter and in my kind of off Twitter life as well. No Worries 2020 says, Adam, I think one of you guys has to mute your mic, by the way. Adam, what do you think is the mindset of 17 to 20-year-olds in India now and India's future? And I'm going to be responsive to that first, just from my kind of visitor's view of things, and knowing the startup and scene and the VC scene as much as I do over there, which you guys still have to discuss with us. So we got a while to go. Is I see more excitement about Space Force and about kind of what happens in China with my friends in China who love Elon Musk and they love SpaceX. And it's something I think, as you had described before, Harsh, where you said kind of China looks to America and they're trying to catch up there, and they love SpaceX. They love Elon Musk. They love our Space Force. In many ways, they're so much more aware of it than we are. They watch all the launches. They're just amazed at how and it goes on. And in India, I'm very close with DRDO, and I'll let you guys explain what that is. And everybody who kind of comes in and out of DRDO, like it's a revolving door, because they're really good at kind of building up talent and then moving them on to projects. For example, Cartosat 3 and et cetera, and a lot of other things. They're really excited about our Space Force as well. They all think it's a big opportunity for them to be that downstream innovation, for them to do propulsion, for them to do aeronautics, for them to do the agriculture, because we're going to be living in cislunar space, which means that you need to be able to grow food in cislunar space and all the other type of things, and propulsion. So I'm going to let you guys now answer the question I never should have answered, but I'm going to let you guys answer now. So go away. It's all yours.
Well, I mean, I have no idea what all Indian 17 to 20-year-olds think.
Yeah.
I think young people everywhere tend to be more optimistic. But I can say that India in general, the Indian youth, is, one would say, surprisingly very optimistic about India's future. I think there is that kind of skepticism or cynicism has not yet crept in. There is not that kind of fanciful pessimism about India's prospects. People strongly believe they will have a better life than their parents, which you cannot say about the young people in America, for example. The millennial culture or the Gen Z culture in the US is that there's a lot of resentment against the boomers, because they think that's where all the money and wealth is. Whereas in India, it's completely the opposite. Anybody with a college degree probably makes much more money than his or their parents ever made. So the sense of upward mobility is very much there. The last couple of years have been tough, but I think on the whole, that's not dented.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think about this issue sometimes also, because I think there is kind of a resentment that, hold on, here comes Rajeev back again, that people's grandparents and parents have, from surface appearances, now that they're observing them in retirement and enjoying them in retirement, they all seem, have the appearance of being very wealthy. The kids today don't really have look 30 years and 40 years back to see how that wealth was acquired. All they see is kind of the temporal isolation. They see it now. And I suppose in India and in other places that, I've traveled, you don't have that generational kind of pension and retirement funds. So people are still kind of aspiring till tomorrow, I guess. And I'm going to skip around here. So Satoshi Yi, thank you so much. Says virtual reality for India. Can you guys be responsive to that? Because cognitive aids and everything is kind of an interesting thing.
Rajeev, go for it.
No, I can't take that.
Rajeev, you're breaking up a little bit. If you want to take it over, Harsh.
Okay, I'll go for it. So I think AR, VR is a massive opportunity for India, augmented reality and virtual reality. And I think, very few people know that Indians actually consume on a per capita basis, if I'm not wrong, unless there's change of recently, more data per day, more internet data per day than Americans or than most people of the world. It's that cheap in India right now. Of course, the transition to 5G will be expensive, will have a lot of capex, but the point is, India is not that far behind as it was for 2G and 3G. And what that means is, again, imagine somebody could be a receptionist for an office in the New York City, sitting in Pune or Bangalore, and doing that job at 1/10 the cost of a receptionist would do in Manhattan. So I think virtual reality, augmented reality is going to be the king of outsourcing and offshoring. And I see a lot of political tensions because you'll finally have white-collar jobs being potentially outsourced and not just manufacturing blue-collar jobs being outsourced from the West. And therefore, there will be a lot of tension. And I think India will have some leverage to play there because it is allowing all the American multinational technology giants to operate in India, unlike the Chinese. Who do not allow the American multinational giants. But that will be interesting.
Okay, guys, and we're moving on because I still want to get to you guys VC into the environments over there. But I want to crank through these questions because they're so interesting. Vishal, thank you so much for being here. Says, any realistic prospect of judicial reforms? What would be on top of your wish list? And remember, this is a speed round, so it's all yours.
I think Harsh and I would probably be of one mind on this, but that would be changing the way judges are appointed in India. So the system of judicial appointments is actually pretty sort of non-meritocratic, you can say, to put it mildly, and pretty non-transparent too. So this is something we go into in detail towards the end in the last chapter of our book. And both of us feel very strongly that this non-transparent kind of non-meritocratic system is in need of reform.
Okay, we're going to continue on. So Ruben, thank you so much for being here. And a speed round, because it's going to get even speedier in a moment, guys. How do you see young people's ambitions in China, city versus rural, work abroad versus staying? And thank you so much for asking that, Ruben.
I think a lot of young Indians still want to go abroad because life in India is still broadly tough. I don't see that changing very rapidly in the next 5-6 years, but I think the delta, the marginal change is definitely coming back towards India. So it's more in the change than in the absolute numbers. The cities versus rural is an excellent question because I think, again, all these technologies of working from home, AR, VR, and now what's happened in the first term of Narendra Modi, we have electrification, and now this term we are putting piped water. So all the urban amenities are actually coming to villages. So I think it will be interesting. A lot of people might be working from villages 4 or 5 years from now, or what we now call villages, but will be small towns 4 or 5 years from now.
Gotcha. And
just to add one point on the VR aspect, Harsh mentioned on how this is going to be a huge wave for outsourcing and stuff like that. I think it will enable actually new kinds of services trade, which right now we're not even envisioning. Because you'll see like a kind of Lollapalooza of automation, new kinds of machines, and virtualization. So there'll be all kinds of new jobs and new kinds of things being done, which we cannot envision right now.
Thank you so much for that.
My friend Balaji has spoken at length about this. Actually, Balaji Srinivasan.
Yeah. He's a good guy. Next time he comes to New York, I said we've got to go out for lunch and or dinner, and there's some stuff for us to argue about. So I'm really looking forward to it. So the emissary coming, thank you so much for being here. Says, do you see any knock-on effects in other industries with the recent agricultural reforms? And can you kind of we're gonna have to go quick because it's been an hour and 10. I want to be really responsive.
think the only kind of obvious knock-on effect I can think is of in the financial markets. So with multinationals now procuring agricultural crops, I think there'll be much more liquidity for futures and options for agricultural commodity. So that's one I can think of. I'll leave it at that.
And one knockoff I would suggest is because of the recent reforms, there will be more kind of a comparative dynamic in the agriculture sector, which was probably muted so far. So you will see people considering alternatives to agriculture much more seriously. So earlier they may have been just satisfied, doing something in a subsistence farming format, but now with other opportunities opening up in manufacturing, I think there will be a kind of labor competition there somewhere.
And Dr. Sexy, thank you so much for being here, says, like in the Philippines, is there a push in India to teach American English specifically?
Not really.
I'm not sure if it's centralized, but I think we have already gone from British English to American English. Although in our spellings, formally we still write like COLOUR. We don't write COLOR, color. So in the spellings, maybe we are more British English, but I think the way people are speaking, nobody like watches British shows that much anymore. Nobody wants to go to Oxford or Cambridge to the extent they want to go to the US Ivy League. So I think in that sense, American English soft culture is definitely more powerful than British English soft culture.
Thank you for that. And Aaron, thank you so much for being here. Asks, where do you see the debates around language heading? And can you give a little bit of a background on that also? I know we're kind of pressing it, but would that be all right?
There are like, I don't know, there are 15, 18, how many scheduled official languages in India? So India does not have like a national language. There's no one national language in India. Hindi and English
are official languages. There's no national language.
Hindi and English are the two official languages. Although most of the judicial and top bureaucratic work actually de facto happens in English. And I think what is happening is there is an organic move towards English, like a combination of Hindi and English being kind of the lingua franca. So for example, both Rajeev and I are from the north and the east of the country, and we can easily relocate to Bengaluru or Bangalore without much problems, although maybe southern Kerala and Tamil Nadu would still be a bit of a stretch. So, but large parts of the country are now accessible, but the government is very clear it will not enforce any one language.
And the language of contracts out there, of the legal contracts?
English.
All English, yeah. The language of business is English, actually.
And that's
it's kind of the working language.
There's a huge benefit to that as well, as it allows for American courts and allows for American interpretation of precedents and everything else. While as in the Chinese Belt and Road client countries, it's all in Mandarin, and it can only be mediated in China within the People's Supreme Court and some other things. Which there's actually a Belt and Road court system that is exclusive, and it's entirely in Mandarin, and it's entirely Chinese law and Mandarin legal language. So I'm going to skip around here. It's an interesting question, and I'm just going to leave it at the surface because I don't want to delve too much into the social issues. But are Indian corporations with a strong international presence affected much by the international corporate culture kind of infiltration of what some people might call woke? And I think there's lots of different ways of expressing it. So I don't want to diminish any of the social arguments about it, but it does have its consequences in how businesses hire, fire, and how they kind of communicate within each other and everything else. So what do you guys see there?
The short answer is no. It does not have that much woke activism. See, in the book, again, A New Idea of India, we write that dharma, which is the one word that encapsulates Indian civilization best. Rajeev and I, we call it the original multiculturalism. By that we mean, in a social sense, the diversity comes naturally to dharma. So in India, we never had to go out of the way to do something like be aggressively, diverse in a sense. Although now there is a focus on voluntary affirmative action, caste quotas in private sector. But mostly in India, people are from all parts of India, from all regional and language backgrounds. Even the Indian Institutes of Management now have gender-based quota. So in India, this happens at multiple levels organically. I don't think the Western kind of woke activism has filtered through, and I don't think it will actually. Although there are definitely attempts.
No, and just to add really quickly to that, so Peter Thiel had written about, I think a long time ago when he was still a student at Stanford, he had said the alternative to the multiculture is the civilization. And what Harsh and I kind of posit in the book is that Indian civilization is a multiculture. It's the original multiculture, as Harsh said.
And we're going to skip around because then I want to get back to discussing venture capital and the venture capital system, but there's so many good questions here. So now it's like the real, like, you know, when you buzz in for Jeopardy, now we're playing for massive amounts of money. You guys, we need to hit these buzzers really quick, and then we need to answer the question and move on to the next one. So Anand, thank you so much for being here. Asked, what could the U.S. standpoint for India's, actually, can you guys read it? Because the light's right in my eyes when I can't really see it. So would you guys be kind enough to
US standpoint for India's candidature on UNSC permanent membership?
Yeah.
So I think the US has already supported India's candidature for permanent membership in United Nations Security Council, but because by definition there's a veto and only one country can veto anything, China is obviously opposed to India's permanent membership. I think Russia, France, UK, and the US have supported it. So I think that would be an interesting dynamic 3, 4, 5 years from now, because India already has a larger economy than 3 out of the 5 permanent UNSC members. It has a larger economy than UK, France, and Russia. Only China and the US have larger economies right now, and India is also a nuclear weapon state. So I think at some point, either India gets admitted or India starts creating its own clubs with like-minded nations.
And thank you so much for being here. Ayokandi, it looks like, and I recognize that picture. So thank you so again for being here. What is the role of millennials in Modi's popularity? So can you kind of break it down from what you think of as the demographic psychographics of it?
So if you try to look at it in a kind of electoral sense, so between 2014 and 2019, one of the fastest growing segments of the voter population was the first time voter base. So in the 2014 election, obviously Narendra Modi was elected with about, I think, 282 seats. And then in 2019, he and his party won 303 seats. And they also increased, the share of the vote. So that kind of tells us that probably a lot of first-time voters did elect him. So I don't think, at least I haven't seen any kind of study on the age demographic of his voter base. But I would venture a guess that he's probably very popular with the young crowd.
There are some surveys, unlike the US, the young do not vote against the so-called right-wing party and for the left-wing in India. They're very much pro-Modi, at least as much as the other demographics. And also, the educated in India lean towards the BJP, the so-called right-wing party. Whereas if you go by educated demographics, college-educated demographic in the US, they lean Democrat or center-left. So in India, both for educated and young people, it's not the way it works in the US. It's the opposite.
Yeah, and the right-left labels also, as again, like we mentioned or lay out in the book, they don't really apply in the Western sense in India, the labels themselves.
Yeah, can you expand on that just a bit? Would that be all right?
No, so for example, on the issue of abortion is obviously a very hot button issue in US politics, for example. But in India, it was the BJP which has kind of given more authority to women to decide what they want to do in terms of keeping a baby or not keeping it. They in fact expanded the ambit for when they can when a woman can decide to terminate pregnancy. For example, this is just one example. Even on the issue of gay rights, even on the issue of LGBTQ and gay rights. So the Indian government actually, and we've written at length on this issue in the book as well. The Indian government actually did not oppose it. When the case was being adjudicated in the Supreme Court of India, the Indian government did not oppose the annulment of Section 377, which kind of criminalizes gaze.
Also,
So
hold on, guys.
left.
We need. I'm sorry. You were saying I didn't hear you there for harsh.
I just wanted to say something. The left in India supports religion-based personal laws. For
Yes.
example, allows Muslim men to have 4 wives, whereas the so-called Indian right actually wants the same laws for everybody, the same civil laws. They want American or Australian-style constitutional personal laws. So in India, actually, what happens is the Islamic extremists are on the center left, so to speak, which is why left and right don't make any sense in India.
Interesting. So, and we're gonna keep skipping around, and then we got a really good question as well. So the next one after this, which this one is a good question. The next one after it is going to be talking about startups. So I'm excited to explore the startups because we've neglected that. Vishu, thank you so much for being here. Ask, is the shrinking of jobs due to technologies in the horizon, such as 3D printing, is that a tail risk?
I think there will be jobs are created, jobs are destroyed. I think the challenge is skilling and reskilling, learning and relearning, more than a particular job per se. This has always been the way of the world. If you look back at 50 or 100 years of economic history, there are always technologies that take away certain jobs, and new roles are created in place of those jobs.
Okay,
India will never have an East Asian style mass manufacturing demographic labor base. I think even today, if we expand manufacturing as a percentage of GDP, it will never be like 100 million plus people in formal manufacturing jobs, probably the way they were in China. It will always be capital and labor together. And in fact, in some ways, in a place like Bihar, which is India's most dense state, 2,000 people per square kilometer, it's difficult to get green field project land for massive factories. Something decentralized like 3D printing could actually work wonders in a state like Bihar. So I wouldn't be that pessimistic. But even so, that's 10 years away.
interesting. And Emissary Co, and thank you again for being here, says, what startups in India excite you, and what issues do they solve, and the unique problems do they solve?
Also, I think there's a bunch of companies in India doing some amazing work in fintech. I think India is probably the best market in the world. It's ground zero for fintech innovation, partly because of many proactive government policies, and also because of very innovative entrepreneurs. And then obviously there's a massive market where there's necessity for financial inclusion, where there is a need for whether on the lending side of the finance or on the equity side of the finance, both sides actually, there is such a massive underpenetration, and there are so many companies trying to solve those problems that I think probably this for me would be probably one of the most exciting spaces right now.
So could you guys discuss a little bit of from your experience in the United States with the venture capital ecosystem here and the startup ecosystem here, which is where our innovation hub is designed to come out of Silicon Alley, and in New York, Silicon Valley, that is. And can you guys give a kind of a description of your experience now and how you kind of compare the VC system in India versus the VC system in America?
So obviously the American system is the most advanced in the world. Obviously the US invented, the asset class. The venture capital asset class was created in the US back in the 60s. And the rest of the world has kind of adopted it in a sense. And there's no question that across the cycle, from seed through IPO, through the life cycle, from the early to mid to late stage life cycle of a company, US remains the world's best ecosystem. I think India is still in the early stages of what is going to be a very robust entrepreneurial ecosystem. But we are still, so for example, in terms of, if you look at exits, so someone had earlier asked on the issue of companies going public. Well, we don't have that many of them yet. We still need to be able to sort of take companies from late stage into the public markets, succeed in public markets for creating wealth and continue to grow a sustainable business and so on. So in that sense, I think India has ways to go, but there is a reason to be very, very optimistic.
But now, how about in finding the small companies that are getting spun out or getting or are occurring within the university system? So, for example, here, like we have, YC over, and we have programs out of Stanford and MIT that then immediately get venture capital, and the venture capital kind of puts them on an assembly line from the A round to the B round to C round, and acquiring new investors along the way and then bringing them public.
No, I think that's also happening in India. If you look at the top sort of technical institutions, the engineering schools, most prominently the IITs, I think this is one of the most extraordinary changes in the country, actually, in my view. Again, something we comment on at length in the book, that today a 25-year-old in India is able to raise, 5, 10, $15 million to build a business. Frankly, this was unthinkable even 10 years ago, or even 20 years ago. It was just impossible. So as a result, the people who entered business were usually those who came from families of means. Today, it is a completely different scenario where a young engineer can start a business with their peers from university.
And do you see that it's a traditional venture capital type of framework for valuations and for exits and liquidity? Or are you seeing it still kind of in a nascent stage where the valuations are done more on a debt rather than in an equity?
No, so I would say, in fact, things are probably too frothy. Many people would say that now that, just out the gate, the kind of valuations that companies are getting are actually, you do get a sticker shock when you discuss some of these numbers. So I would say, you have all the big American venture firms in India today. Many of the non-American or many of the homegrown Indian funds themselves are also kind of drawback ties to America in some way, shape, or form, either through education or through having worked at venture and PE firms there. So in that sense, there is that cultural kind of learning and transference of knowledge has already happened from the US system to the Indian ecosystem.
Yeah, I still, and again, it's conversations I have a lot from my experience with the Ministry of Defense and with my experience with DRDO is, and some of the labs they have out there, is that they're still not really used to how to scale a company and how quickly you have to kind of grab these companies, because the kids who create these companies will go on to other projects. So unless they're funded really quickly, the innovators.
That's true, Adam, that is true, Adam. I would just add that the minor difference does come from sector to sector. So for an area like defense, which is a pretty nascent area, there was no mention of any private sector activity in defense even 5 years ago. It was minimal. Only now the doors just started opening a bit. So for areas like defense, for example, that issue is there because, frankly, where do you find that management bandwidth? Where do you find those executive leaders? There is no private sector to speak of. So we're just building that up right now. But if you look at a sector like software, for example, if you look at a sector like consumer internet or software, those sectors have that depth. You can find engineers, you can find mid-tier leaders, you can find senior leaders, senior executives, CEOs. So it's a very different thing altogether when you go to a different sector like that.
We're going to skip around. Oh, I hear an echo. Because we're going to have to come to an end, and everyone has just been so great. So Thanaji Invest says, I agree with, and thank you for being here. I agree with the big picture with both of you. The ground realities are much different, though. Can you comment on that?
I mean, realities are obviously not very ideal because, again, we are a $2,000 per capita income society. But then the big rewards are those who go and manage these ground realities, and it's not as smooth as the US in terms of starting a company, in terms of closing a company or running a company. The government is trying to make it easier every year. They have improved the ranking and the ease of doing business globally. but it will take time. I agree. It's definitely not Singapore or UK or the US.
Well, I get asked about this because people are always interested in kind of what an American investor who's kind of really used to building things and doing things over here thinks about what I'm seeing over there. And I've traveled a lot and over there, and I can say that I have probably a higher pain tolerance than most, and I probably have more patience, perhaps, than most. But at the same time, I know what I'm buying into. So I still think that within certain things, within Make in India specifically, because it requires so much innovation with AI, it requires so much innovation with propulsion, with composite metals, and just how do you launch a spaceship, basically. Or how do you do international friend and foe systems? I'm very involved with encryption. So we have a lot of challenges, and a lot of them have to do with acquiring talent. A lot of them even have to do with acquiring the physical labor because there hasn't been any knowledge transfer over the last few years. The people who were doing things years ago don't do them anymore. So they just didn't pass them on, or they lost the skill, they moved on to other things. All of a sudden, those skills are needed again. So I think I just have a bit more patience. It's kind of like when you buy a house and you imagine the way a room is going to look. But I understand with a country that's that big and where you have to shake some of the old out of it, which allows the new to come in. I do have that patience. And I get asked about Make in India a lot because there's so much buzz about it, but then sometimes there's kind of a decoupling where there's kind of misconceptions about it. And these things take time. I think the number one thing that I look as a leading indicator is where are the smart kids going. So before you have anything else, where are those smart kids going? I do think we need to resolve some of our immigration issues here because we don't want to compromise them as students over here. But I still say that India still needs to start just driving them back, just creating a capitalist system that really rewards risk, which is kind of a new system within India.
I agree.
Yeah.
No, agree. Yeah.
So I want to make sure I'm responsive because there's so many good things here, and we're gonna have to go in just a few minutes. And I've said that for a while, but this time I really mean it. So Debadri, thank you so much for being here. Debadri C says, what political reforms do you want to see, like the expansion of legislature federalism?
I personally think we should have, on the first part, we should have more inter-party democracy. For example, the removal of anti-defection laws. And on the second part, we need more competitive federalism. In India, the GST law has been passed. It's a great law. Finally, have one market. But one of the potential downsides of the law, which can be easily fixed from within the GST system itself, is that the states no longer have that much of a lever over the revenue they get. They can't change the tax rates. And we need more competition between Indian states. So just the two big issues is first, have more inter-party democracy, and second, have more competition between states.
And I would add just one thing there. So there are many issues in India that tend to get sort of confounded.
But keep in mind, guys, keep in mind, we don't have the same value-added tax system that you guys have over there. So a lot of people are going to be unfamiliar with the value-added tax, and a lot of people are going to be unfamiliar with all of its mutations, like you guys now have GST.
Yes.
So if you guys can really briefly just kind of explain the tax regime over there.
Yeah, so the GST, the goods and services tax, is a VAT or a value-added tax, and the value-added tax is very simple. If I buy something for $100, I pay say $10 tax on it, then I create value on it and then sell it for $200. 20 more dollars of tax are added, but the $10 I paid for the raw material, I get it as a refund. So effectively, I only paid $10 of tax. And the point there is you don't have cascading of taxes. So the problem with sales taxes without any value-added component is if I buy something and then I use it for making something else, I pay a sales tax on the entire price. So the value-added tax is only the value-added in that step. That's why the name value-added tax. It's probably a more scientific tax, and that's what the GST in India is. We already had a VAT in India earlier, VAT, but the way it became a GST is A, we added services to it, and B, we made it interstate. So now it's a national market because we now have a very good back-end computer database recording all the transactions, and it has been a reform in work in progress. It's done very well in the last 2-3 years, despite a lot of negative commentary. But I think now or going forward, at some point, we'll have to either allow states to have some kind of income tax or the GST rates to be flexible. And we write about that in the book because you cannot have the states not have one of the levers or incentives of tax competition. And that's very powerful going forward.
I can just tell you from my
and just to add one political reform actually. So there's something in India called the union list, the state list, and the concurrent list. So different topics are in different lists of these different lists, so that there's a kind of allocation of who does what. So some of the matters that end up on the concurrent list actually tend to create sort of whose say should be dominant over the other. So some reform is in order there. In fact, certain chief ministers have also suggested that maybe doing away with the concurrent list is not such a bad idea.
Okay, we're going to get into two last things, and one of them is going to be from Safari 82, and the other one's going to be from me. Okay, so it ties into everything else we've been discussing, which ultimately for me is how do you bring in more Western dollars? Right? At the end of the day, it's going to require a significant amount of investment and a significant amount of collaboration to be able to improve India to be kind of an ally, I guess, with the U.S. Is that fair to say? Because you guys have a different terminology for it than I do. But so Safari 82 says, is there a case for separate courts, separate corporate courts to attract more foreign investment?
I'm not sure about separate courts, but we definitely need much more capacity expansion. And secondly, for many corporate misdemeanors, they need to be civil or monetary penalties and not criminal penalties. And the government is already taking steps because theoretically, a lot of your misdemeanors could have landed you in jail. And that is now being changed. So I would just leave it at that. We need more capacity, separate or together.
I think that'll bring in a lot more. I think the change in the recent ownership rules, I can now own 74% of my companies, which means I can also bring in more investors into them. And a lot of my investors are industry, I can't say names of the company, but a lot of the investors I will be bringing in are American companies doing business over there. And they've had their own limitations. So they need people like me to help them kind of scale companies outside of their own environment, kind of incubate new technologies, spin them out, incubate, and then they need to rejoin. Kind of crazy to explain now, and it would take another hour and 37 minutes. So I'm going to go back to this question, and I'm going to ask kind of our departing, questions, which is about the private and the public markets. So what do you see happening within, because if there is a Make in India that's focused on the defense right now, how is that impacting the publicly traded companies? Like we have our Boeing, we have our Lockheed, we have our Raytheons. How is that kind of translating over to what's occurring in the public markets in India? And I know one of you is going to throw you that, so please answer that. And then how is that also translating to the venture capital markets in India? Where are you seeing money going, and where are you seeing valuations being moved up?
So I'll take the public market one, and I'll let Rajeev take the venture capital one. So on the public market one, India already has the world's largest number of listed companies. I think it's around 5,000, or so it's slightly more than the number of listed companies in the US. Obviously, the average Indian company is much smaller. Rajeev, I think it's echoing through you, through your, yeah. So I think it's already smaller than the average American company. But in terms of how defense will play out, the first thing to remember, just to going back to what you mentioned about more Western dollars coming in. So in public markets, in the Indian equity public markets are very sophisticated for our stage of development. And recently we've added 2 new instruments called REITs, the Real Estate Investment Trusts, and the Infrastructure Investment Trusts. So India now has some of the world's largest REITs in Asia. So I'm not even sure if China still has REITs. And what that allows is, because there is like trillions, tens of trillions of dollars in the global bond and debt markets, getting zero or negative returns in sovereign bonds in the US, Europe, and Japan. If you can actually give them 5, 7, 8% returns in India for infrastructure, real estate, and other relatively safe debt kind of instruments or indices, then you can have massive amounts of money coming into India. And I think that's exactly what's happening. The REIT investing in India is relatively new. It was formed in the last 3-4 years. Now Indian sovereign debt is entering global bond indices, and we are slowly opening a capital account. And India 10, just to give you an idea, India 10-year yields 6%.
So can you give a sense of what's happening within the stock market over there, and where you're seeing kind of the biggest movement?
In India, in the last 10 years, consumer and financials led the rally. So in the Indian stock market cap together is about $2 trillion.
And what are you seeing? I'm sorry, we're going to wrap up in just a moment. So what are you seeing leading the rally right now? You know, in the United States, FANG stocks.
I think the next 10 years will be industrials, make in India, real estate, infrastructure, and will be less kind of crazy multiples for financials and consumer discretionary. I think we'll have a proper build-out rally of more hardcore industrial kind of physical infra stocks, which were completely out of fashion for the last decade.
And Rajeev?
So what's really exciting on the private side actually is that a few new industries which were completely off limits are now open for business. So namely, two of the big ones there are agriculture and defense. So back in May, the government essentially, to put it really in a summary form, denationalized the agriculture industry. They opened up markets which were restricted to like kind of state-controlled local markets for trade in agriculture goods, and now it's possible to sort of have interstate trade in agriculture, which was actually not possible in India earlier. So the combination of that with digitalization and new kinds of like farming technologies, I think that space is just has so much inefficiency that there's going to be some big players that make an impact there, I feel. Likewise, Adam, we've discussed defense.
Yeah.
And connected to that is even the new area in India of space, which was again off limits in the private sector.
Yeah.
And so, again opened up 5 months ago. So space tech. I mean, we all know India's prowess in space technology. ISRO being the lowest cost launch provider in the world. And there's a wealth of aerospace and kind of astronautical talent in the country. So I think it's just a matter of time where some of these things come together, and you will see some really cutting edge companies coming out of India doing this work.
And then I'm going to get into the last question. So how many venture capital firms do you see over there, and how many people do you see that kind of define themselves, perhaps improperly, nevertheless, as venture capitalists? So how big is the scene of right now scouring the landscape for entrepreneurs and for innovative companies, and then giving them a valuation and then kind of architecting them?
I think it is I'm kind of a veteran almost in a sense because I've been here for a decade plus now almost. And if I compare it back to 2009 or 2008, when I just sort of started kicking this around, at that time even the word venture capital was not known to people, even to large investors in public markets, even to HNIs, family offices. They just didn't know what is venture capital. That it was a completely alien concept. And today the change is such that practically every large family office in India, every major HNI in India is today looking at this asset class seriously and allocating capital to this asset class. Likewise for large fund houses, likewise for even global venture investors. Like I mentioned some time back, I think most of the American venture funds are active in India, the big ones, whether it's Sequoia, whether it's Lightspeed, and a bunch of.
Yeah, I'm sorry. There was a lag there. They're definitely making investments. There's also been reluctance, but I think hopefully with the new changes, there's some reluctance, but I think you can definitely see it gaining pace. So there's going to be actually two last, one last comment and then one question. and then you guys broke the record for the amount of time we spent. So, hi, Harveen. Thank you so much for being here. This is a quick one for you guys. Says comment, business process outsourcing, BPO, must be gearing up for another huge boom with the global shift to remote work.
We already discussed that. Yeah, I agree. We already discussed that.
And Sona Kushi, thank you so much for being here. And I recognize that picture, and I recall from last week that you are, it's very early in the morning for you, so thank you so much for spending this time with us. Ask, what's up with the privatization of many public sectors in India? Is there plans for 100% privatization?
Probably not 100%, but the government is definitely pushing for privatization, which it did not the last few years. A, the government needs resources, and B, the government realizes that this is the way to increase efficiency. However, having said that, they will not sell at any random price. They will wait for a stock market rally, and probably public sector banks or financials would be the last to be privatized. Something like Air India and some of the other companies would be privatized earlier.
Rajeev?
Yeah, so I think some identified sectors will see complete privatization, as the government said back in May. And there will be some sectors, like Harsh mentioned, which will see partial privatization. There will be a limit on the number of PSUs, or there will be kind of consolidation in those sectors.
Guys, we did it. It's been an hour and 46 minutes. We were only expecting it to be an hour. And I really want to thank everybody for their time. For me, this is, we've lost so much with COVID. And one of the things that we've lost is just the ability to all kind of sit down for lunch and sit down for dinner and ask each other a lot of questions. So this was it. And thank you for allowing Rajeev, Harsh, and myself time on your timeline today. And as they're both putting up their book, I've read it. It's great, chapter by chapter, and is really great. And I always have to be careful because I'm an extreme salesperson. It's how I define myself in my life. And I've got to tell you, so which means I have to be cautious because I know that I can be a bit too emotional and persuasive sometimes. So I try and tame that back. Great book. It is so helpful chapter by chapter in explaining trade and explaining the military, and also giving some really good context for social movements that are happening here that otherwise we wouldn't really be able to understand because it's so different than what we're experiencing in America. You're still on mute. Everybody's on mute.
Thank you, Adam.
No, yeah, it was great to be on, Adam. Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I see people, so I'm going to put that on there because it's such a good way to say goodbye to everybody. So Hi Harvin says, buy the book. I agree. And as a follow-up, I'm going to put the link to the book. And I'm so happy you guys wrote it. And you guys have so many fans in India that we're just so excited to see you guys come on and kind of discuss the financial markets that you guys have so much experience with. And also the book, which is you guys have spent a lot of time, and it really shows. It's a really good book, and the website is great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it, everybody. We did it. So I want to thank everybody again so much for their time, and have a wonderful day. And goodbye to everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Adam.